Welcome to the Wealth Wisdom, where knowledge becomes power and power builds your future.
Everything you've been told about inflation is a distraction. Prices don't rise naturally. Markets don't self-correct. And the economy isn't some wild animal that governments try to tame. That's the myth. The truth is far more controlled, far more coordinated, and far more invisible. Because inflation, this silent force that shapes your rent, your groceries, your savings, your future isn't just an economic phenomenon. It's a tool used with precision by institutions that most people never think about, yet feel the effects of every single day. And the most surprising part, they can use this tool without you ever realizing what happened until it's already too late. Most people assume inflation is caused by companies raising prices or governments printing too much money. But what if those explanations are only the surface? What if the real power sits with an institution designed to be untouchable, unelected, and shielded from public pressure? And what if it has the ability to control the value of money itself quietly, indirectly, invisibly, without making it look like control at all? The story of how central banks gained the ability to manage inflation without attracting attention stretches back over a century, through crises, political battles, financial collapses, and one of the most influential economic experiments in human history. And the consequences of that story are affecting you right now, whether you realize it or not. To understand how we got here, we need to go back to a moment when the world was broken, unpredictable, and desperate for order. The early 1900s were a time of chaos in global finance. Money wasn't stable. Banks failed regularly. Governments couldn't control their economies. And ordinary people lived one crisis away from disaster. Nations needed a system, something strong enough to hold everything together, but flexible enough to prevent collapse. That desire for stability created the rise of central banking. And at first, these institutions didn't try to control inflation. They simply wanted to restore trust. But trust is a tricky thing. Once you have it, you can use it. And once you use it, people stop noticing how much influence you've gained. The first major turning point came during the Great Depression. Governments were powerless. Banks were failing everywhere. The global economy was collapsing like a row of dominoes. And in this darkness, economists proposed a new idea: that central banks could revive the system by manipulating interest rates and influencing the money supply. It sounded technical, almost harmless, but it was revolutionary. It meant that a small group of financial architects could guide the entire economy with subtle, almost invisible decisions that looked like corrections instead of commands. The strategy worked. The economy slowly revived, and with every tiny victory, central banks gained more trust, more confidence, and more authority. Then came World War II. Nations were drowning in debt. Inflation threatened to explode as governments printed money to fund the war effort. Something had to be done. So in 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the world made a deal. Currencies would be linked to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be linked to gold. It was supposed to prevent inflation forever. But central banks quietly gained something else: coordination. They now had a unified system, a shared mission. and more influence than they had ever imagined. Still, none of this compares to what happened next. A single decision changed everything. When the United States ended the gold standard, money was no longer backed by anything physical. No gold, no silver, no real limits. Money became a belief system, pure trust. And the institutions trusted most were central banks. Suddenly, they were the guardians of inflation. If money had no anchor in reality, someone had to decide how much it was worth. So how did you control something so abstract? How do you manipulate the value of money itself? With tools that seem harmless, tools that look logical, tools that people don't question. The first tool is interest rates. When inflation rises, central banks raise interest rates. That's the simple explanation. But the real mechanism is far more sophisticated. By raising rates, they make borrowing expensive, slow the flow of credit, reduce spending, and eventually force prices down. But notice how subtle this is. No one says we are reducing your purchasing power. Instead, they say, we are protecting the economy. And since people don't see the mechanism directly, only the outcome, they assume it's natural. This is the invisible skill central banks mastered, controlling inflation indirectly. Without touching prices themselves, they never order companies to raise or lower anything. They simply adjust financial gravity, and everything else falls into place. But interest rates alone aren't enough. Modern central banks have far more advanced techniques, methods created. After the 2008 financial crisis, when the world came dangerously close to total collapse, that crisis revealed something shocking. Interest rates had limits. When rates hit zero, central banks needed new weapons. Enter quantitative easing, better known as QE. Most people still don't understand what QE actually is. They think it's printing money. It's not. It's something far more subtle and far more powerful. Central banks create digital money out of thin air and use it to buy government bonds and financial assets. This forces interest rates down, floods markets with liquidity, boosts stock prices, and stabilizes banks, all without ever making a public announcement like, we are manipulating the system. They simply call it a policy tool. Here's the key. By quietly influencing credit markets and asset prices, central banks can control inflation without ever touching everyday prices directly. When they want the economy to heat up, they push money into the system. When they want it to cool down, they pull money out. This is the invisible dial behind inflation, a dial that turns smoothly, silently, and often without public awareness. But the story doesn't end with QE. When the economy became dangerously addicted to low rates and easy money, central banks invented a new method: forward guidance. It sounds harmless, but it's psychological manipulation at a macro scale. Instead of acting, central banks simply talk. They announce future intentions, subtle hints, coded messages, strategic phrases to nudge markets in the direction they want. It's financial hypnosis. A single sentence, like "we expect inflation to be temporary," can shift billions of dollars. A phrase like "rates will remain low for an extended period" can boost stock prices worldwide. Central banks discovered they could control inflation expectations, which is almost as powerful as controlling inflation itself. If people believe prices will rise, they behave differently. If they believe prices will stabilize, they relax. Central banks don't just control money, they control perception. But every system, no matter how elegant, has a breaking point. And in 2020, we found it. When the pandemic hit, central banks unleashed the largest wave of QE in history. Trillions of dollars entered the system. Rates dropped to near zero. Credit expanded at a pace humanity had never seen before. For a moment, it looked like salvation. But beneath the surface, inflation was boiling. At first, central banks insisted it was temporary. But prices kept rising. Supply chains broke. Debt exploded. And suddenly, the world watched inflation hit levels not seen in 40 years. So central banks did what they always do when the system overheats: they tightened the screws. Interest rates shot up, liquidity vanished, the economy slowed. And once again, people blamed companies, governments, supply chains, anything except the hidden mechanism at the root of it all. You might ask, if central banks cause inflation and then fix inflation, are they actually controlling it? Or are they managing the consequences of their own actions? That question is dangerous. It reveals something important. Inflation is not an accident. It's baked into the system. It's expected. It's even desired. A little inflation encourages spending. A little inflation reduces the burden of debt. A little inflation keeps the machine running. Zero inflation might sound ideal, but to central banks, it's a threat, a sign that the economy is freezing, stagnating, or drifting toward recession. So how do central banks control inflation without anyone noticing? They've mastered three forms of influence: controlling the cost of money, controlling the flow of money, and controlling the expectation of money. Everything else: market crashes, housing bubbles, debt cycles, currency shifts are just byproducts of those adjustments. But here is the part no one talks about. Every central bank action has winners and losers. When interest rates rise, homeowners and borrowers suffer, but banks and bondholders benefit. When QE floods markets, stocks rise, helping the wealthy but leaving others behind. When inflation increases, savers lose value while debt-heavy governments gain relief. This is why inflation always feels unfair, because it is. Throughout history, central banks have learned to perform a delicate balancing act. Keep inflation just high enough to stimulate the system, but not so high that people panic. Adjust rates just enough to slow growth, but not enough to trigger collapse. Manipulate expectations just enough to guide markets, but not enough to reveal the manipulation. That is the invisible art of inflation control. And the more invisible it becomes, the more powerful it is. Today, central banks are facing a new challenge: digital currencies, global instability, and record-breaking debt levels. The old tools are becoming less effective. Inflation is becoming harder to control. And the world is entering a new era, where the invisible laws may no longer work as smoothly as they once did. If history teaches us anything, it is this: every system that grows too complex eventually reaches a moment where it must reset. Inflation is not just a number. It's a pressure valve, a warning sign. a consequence of choices made by institutions we rarely examine. As you watch the prices around you rise and fall, remember, none of it happens by accident. The decisions are made quietly, behind closed doors, in meetings you will never attend, using tools you may never see. But their effects shape your life in ways you feel every time you spend a single dollar. Understanding this system isn't just about economics. It's about awareness. Awareness of the forces shaping your financial reality. Awareness of how value is manipulated. Awareness of how power operates in the shadows of the global economy. So what should you take away from all this? First, inflation is not a natural event. It's engineered, guided, and managed sometimes successfully, sometimes disastrously. Second, the tools central banks use are subtle by design. The more invisible they appear, the more effective they become. And third, the only real protection you have is education, because once you understand how the system works, you stop being controlled by it. But here is the warning. The next decade will test the limits of everything central banks have built. The system is stretched thin. Debt is massive. Rates are unstable. And inflation is no longer predictable. Something will eventually give. The question is not whether central banks can control inflation. The real question is, how long can they continue doing it without anyone noticing the true cost? If you want to understand the next chapter of global finance and avoid becoming a victim of the system, make sure you subscribe, stay aware, and keep exploring the hidden truths behind money, power, and the forces shaping your future. Because this story isn't over. It's only beginning.